to Big Blend Radio's Nature Connection Show, a podcast covering nature, wildlife, science, and the environment. Welcome, everyone. We're very excited to have Denali Sai Nalamalapu join us on today's Big Blend Radio Nature Connection Show to talk about her graphic memoir. It's out now. It is called Holler, a graphic memoir of rural resistance. And you know we cover the Appalachian region quite a bit on Big Blend Radio in so many ways. And in fact, we've done quite a bit on what happens to the Appalachian corridor in regards to the Appalachian Trail. We've touched on coal mining. We've done so many things over 18 years of podcasting. And so today I just feel like it's come to like it just puts it all together when you read Holler, which is a fantastic book. And I think it really spans generations being able to get it. It just makes sense to have it as a graphic memoir. So welcome, Denali. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Lisa. I'm great.
How did you decide to do the graphic version of this? Because I think it's kind of like when we were going through COVID and people didn't understand a hidden disease we had to have the little virus picture, So I kind of feel that way when we're doing these kinds of big fights, that there has to be some kind of visuals for people to understand how it's impacting people.
I've been a climate organizer for the better half of the past decade, and my main goal is making the movement more accessible to people. So working in this pipeline fight had me thinking a lot about what are the ways we haven't yet communicated the struggle against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And what came to mind was this illustrative mode of communicating the pipeline story. The Mountain Valley Pipeline fight was a decade long, so there's a long story to tell, and Holler only captures part of it. But I started in comics as a young artist, so I had the skills that I needed to create this project. And so I sort of put together the strategic element of this is something that I think would help the movement communicate what we've been up to, and the reality that I already had those skills so I could make the project happen.
Oh man, I love it how you've done it on everybody's perspective, every side, and it's such a diverse collection of people. And we often say that when people join over a specific cause or a specific thing, an interest even, then petty stuff goes away. It kind of gets to, and then there's crossing over into communicating with people that you never would think that you would communicate with, maybe, kind of it goes over barriers. Is that something that you experienced through this?
Definitely. And I think that's a unique part of pipeline movements at large, that pipelines really impact people in so many different ways. They impact indigenous communities because oftentimes with big pipelines like the Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone XL, and also the Mountain Valley Pipeline, you're going through indigenous communities living on the land and also whose ancestral home is the land. And then landowners get impacted because the pipeline comes through their land. They might lose their land from eminent domain. People like me who care about the environment get very concerned because of air pollution, water pollution, climate pollution, all of these things. And so it really often is, and this was true with the Mountain Valley Pipeline, a meeting of people of many different backgrounds. I tried to write a book that shared some of those diverse backgrounds, in part because I'm not someone who people typically think of living in the Appalachian region as a queer person of color. We often think of certain people who vote a certain way as living in the Appalachian region. But this pipeline fight was really a testament to how diverse the region is.
It really is. And it's also difficult because it's in the rural areas. People are in all these little coves, and when Hurricane Helene happened, that really showcased, oh my gosh, look at where people are stranded. And, we went through a lot of that with our friends, and we're up in the region a lot, especially in the North Carolina region. And, it just, to get everybody together, it's not that easy. Well, now we have technology, which is fantastic about that, in a way for people to unite, but also getting the word out, I think has been very difficult. We covered the Dakota Access Pipeline. It was Labor Day weekend. I remember we're like, oh, it's Labor Day Monday. Let's just, no point in having a show. And at that point, we were doing live broadcasts. And we got a call from Cody Hall, who was from the Red Warrior Camp. And he's like, you've done all these things on environment and indigenous people. Can you please do something? No one is doing it. And I'm like, what's going on? Major media had not picked it up. The only person who had done anything was Amy from Democracy Now! And then she was getting arrested. Cody Hall got arrested. Right after being on our show, we did like an hour and a half broadcast with him of what was going on. And so many people were getting arrested. And at that point is when they were setting dogs on the pregnant women that were chained to, the bulldozers. And this was over ancestral lands. And I kept going, where's, President Barack Obama was president at the time. And I was just like, what's going on? Why, all these indigenous people are, really standing up visually. And this is where I would have loved to, like, oh, can you go and do this one now too? Because people didn't understand that, water is life. That came out of that. So a very strong message. The unity of indigenous people from around the world was something positive, even though there was a loss, and at that time. But I don't think people understood the importance of ground and water. It was like a stupid argument. Like, it affects the ground underneath the water. And so I think having what you've done really helps. But going through this and not always having a win, there's still something to be said for going through all of it, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially in this moment in the climate crisis where we are seeing scientists and researchers say we might have passed 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, or we're on our way to passing it, and we're looking at the future. Many of us definitely would still hope, but adjusting our vision for the future in some way, because it won't necessarily look like gray, dark fossil fuel hell, or necessarily like pristine Earth forever back to what it was before fossil fuel abundance and expansion of production. It might be something in the middle, and that involves many different wins and losses. And I hope that the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight and the way Holler tells it can help people sort of like adjust to that reality, that a win isn't necessarily like 100% the pipeline goes away, everyone's land is restored, everyone's paid for their time sort of thing. Sometimes these pipelines end up being built, and there's the reality and the stories and the strength of 10 years of resistance that is also important when we're thinking about our future on this planet.
Yeah, because like when you look at Dakota Access Pipeline, the biggest gathering of indigenous people ever in the world was such a beautiful thing that it's beyond, measurable. So I think that was really, really powerful. And now as we look at climate change, we're looking at all these little islands and going, okay, who are the indigenous people there? What are we doing there? And so we need to kind of get into that mode too of understanding different cultures to be able to really fight this, The other thing, what you just said, I think is so important is that we may win. Mm-hmm. But from like right now, Chaco Canyon is up for grabs again for fracking. And we've covered that since we started. And you win, and then somebody else gets into power somewhere, and you have to start all over again. So then it's kind of like some people get, oh, well, that's it. I'm not doing that again. The reality is we just pick up where we left off and get a new tactic. Yeah, so we need to understand that.
Totally. And I think this is something that can be learned from studying movements and learning from our elders and the fights that came before us. Because the reality is, when you're involved in social justice movements, your work never really ends. And that's how I feel as a climate organizer. I think that perspective comes with a degree of privilege because I don't live on land that the pipeline directly crosses. I'm a community member that lives in a community that's impacted by the pipeline. But for people for whom their life and safety is at stake, it's different. But for me, this fight was never going to end, even if Biden hadn't intervened by bowing down to Senator Manchin and having the pipeline greenlit by all of these regulatory agencies and courts. There is still so much more to fight. And as you said, these projects never really go away. Like, even people who defeated the Atlantic Coast Pipeline are continually aware that the threat remains, and there are still new fossil fuel projects being proposed all
Oh
over.
yeah. Right now it's big. We're opening up more than we've ever had before, And so it's what I'm not hearing from all these projects is cutting back. We're hearing let's do more oil, let's drill more, do more fracking, do more of these things so we can be dependent on our own soil. We don't need to go, over and get it from the Saudis and all of that stuff, right? But how about we just cut back a little bit even on everything,
And they're not saying the truth, which is that a lot of these projects in the Southeast are built for export. And so when we're talking about energy independence, an important thing to talk about is what does it look like to use the resources that we have in abundance, like the sun and the wind, to help us meet our energy needs in the cheapest way possible, rather than putting the cost of these massive projects on ratepayers who are already struggling with their energy bills.
Yeah. Yeah, I was seeing that in Sweden, they're making their roads actually charge electric vehicles. I'm like, that is the coolest thing ever. So I know people are so afraid of change. It is, and yet it's the one thing that's going to be the most constant thing we have in life is change, is dealing with change. And when I look at this world of getting more efficient, it's not all or nothing. And I think that's the one thing. I know one person who told me, I'm not voting for Biden. This was a long time ago because he's going to force me to have an electric car. And I'm like, that's not quite how it is. But like I see, so there's a lot of, you don't, throw the baby without and the bathwater out together. And that's kind of where it's just become a very polarized thing between people. And I think like with having a book gives people some visuals, some context, some immediate understanding, without having to read such heavy. I mean, when the Dakota Access Pipeline happened, we had no clue what was going on. So we started Googling everything about who owns the oil thing, what's coming through, and it was every single bank that people bank with, every single bank. And we're sitting there going, well, we're getting rid of this credit card. And then we're like, we got rid of every bank. When we started looking, every major bank, I don't care what their commercials are and how good they are in their commercials, they are all invested in oil. And so then we're like, oh, we need an attorney. So we started looking for oil attorneys. That was stupid because we had no clue about how all of this worked other than when we worked with organizations. It was a holiday weekend. We did not know what was going on in that level. So any advice for people that want to jump in there, and I mean, I say do that research because you'll actually, but your book is a lot easier to read than what we did because that there was stuff in there I don't know what this is, I don't know what that means, so any tips for people getting started?
That's part of how I wrote the book, how I wrote it in a way that was fairly simple and accessible, because there is a lot of climate change literature out there, and there's going to be more. And a lot of it is black and white text that's really long, and not everyone has time to read it. I hope that a lot of people do, but the reality is that people are struggling to raise their kids and juggle a bunch of jobs, or maybe they're young readers and they're still learning to get a sense of themselves as readers and what they like to read and how long things can be, or they're elder readers. A lot of my friends who are elders say they don't have time or don't have the attention to spend a lot of time reading big books. So I wanted to write a book that people could read if they didn't feel like some of what's out there wasn't for them. And I do think part of that is that the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight involved so many citizen scientists and researchers going into like the troves of federal regulatory agency documents and processes, and how
Gee.
do landslides work on the Appalachian slopes, and how is that made worse by putting a pipeline through them? All of this stuff, we have this wealth of information, and I hope some of that is conveyed through Holler, though you could write a book as long as for the rest of your life and not convey all the information we dug up about the Mountain Valley Pipeline. But I do think the key thing for me is that in your movement for what you're resisting, you and your community have people with different skill sets. So there were definitely people in the pipeline fight who didn't love to read pages and pages of jargon and governmental speak. And there were people like in chapter 2 of the book, um, Chapter 2 tells the story of Becky Crabtree, who's a science teacher in West Virginia. And Becky's someone who was used to reading research. Or Caroline Givens is actually Carolyn's in chapter 2, and Becky's further into the book in chapter 4. But Carolyn is also has a science background. And so it helps to have like a diversity of skill sets in the movement, and try and cultivate a place where people can grow rather than a place where everyone thinks and talks the same, because that helps so much with like having people who like to do different things and can bring different things to the movement.
Yeah, yeah. I had to learn that lesson hard because, we get involved, especially at one point, I mean, we were going after Monsanto and we were calling the White House on podcasts. I mean, we were doing all kinds of stuff. The corn people came after us. I mean, I was getting us into trouble and it was fun, but just kind of like being, just poke. And I remember there was an issue in Hawaii is going through a lot. We have a friend out there, a musician, who has really put himself on the line and funded environmental research on Monsanto. What are they doing to the farmlands? And at that point, they were surrounding Kamehameha schools. And this is like little kids around in, what Agent Orange land, which was insane. And I remember getting all upset and I called him. I'm like, did you hear this? And this is happening. He's like, Lisa, you got to calm. He's like, remember who and what you do. This is what you do. You have a media outlet, you have a podcast, you have your magazines. That is valuable. If you start going and doing protests, you need to be there to cover the protest, but not be in the protest, because now you're not using your skill set. And it was like, everybody has to use what they have. And I thought, oh, okay. I felt like, all right, because I felt like I had to be everywhere. And you get so upset. And I think that's something too for communities. It can be really depressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think like having a sense of focus and people who can ground you can help. Like some people, and I covered this in the book, but like not everyone can go to a protest, whether it's because of their job or because of their physical abilities or whatever it is. And so having many different ways you can be part of the climate movement, whether it's prioritizing electrification of your house, or it's putting solar in your farmland, or it's protesting. Like there are all these different ways we can become involved in. I think cultivating a culture where we're all welcome in those different ways is quite important to having a successful movement.
Yeah, and education is part of the movement, and sometimes that gets dropped because it's a long road. Education is a long road, and there's many ways of doing it, like how you've done your book. You've done such a good job on getting people's attention and your storytelling. And I think when people can relate to a character in a book, when you've got real life people, so that is even more powerful. It's like, here's a true person. This is what they did. This is who they are. You can identify and kind of connect in that way. And I think that's a very powerful way of educating. But education of, if people think they're going to have to learn about, all the microcosms in oil or whatever, there's people that are going to just like, that's it, I'm out. So it's sometimes the people stories are the big things.
Yeah, I think that's very true for me and for many people that I know. And I remember from a young age, like the stories that I read and the people I met in those stories really shaped how I think now and the direction my life went. And I hope that people can pick up Holler and feel connected to at least one of the people in the book. Like maybe their grandmother was a nurse and they connect to Carolyn Givens, or maybe they were involved in protests as a college student and they connect to Michael James Duramo. But I hope hope that there's like enough of a sampling of different types of people that people will have someone in their life that it makes them think of, and then they'll connect to those stories and then hopefully think about the environment that they love, that they want to protect in their own lives.
Now, how did you get started on all of this? I mean, what made you go, hey, there's a thing going on here in our community and we don't like it. And some people do like it. And sometimes people are raised to like it. You know what I mean? It could be your own family is pro this pipeline and you may be sitting there going, I don't think that looks really good.
Totally. My start in the climate movement was kind of like, it was kind of a bit of a journey. And also there was a point at which I really started to think about my life being this movement. And that was when I was living on the island of Borneo in Malaysian territory. And I was
Oh,
living
wow.
in rainforests that were so biodiverse and amazing, but also were being cut down for the palm oil industry. And I was
Ooh.
also living in a community that benefited from the palm oil industry and also felt an immense amount of loss. Many of the people in my community were indigenous to the land and very connected to the land, and seeing it torn apart in that way was devastating. And so I was living in those complexities and then also reading about how, especially the Western world, was communicating climate change in a very scientific way from a very Western perspective, where the climate crisis was coming, even though where I'm from in India, the climate crisis has been a reality for over a decade now. And so I was seeing these ways, these opportunities for improvement in the way that we talk about climate change and make it accessible to different communities. And that's what got me interested in spending my career and life in the climate movement.
Oh, wow. That's cool. It's cool that you were there in Borneo area. That's super cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
I did. Yeah, I was raised in Africa, in South Africa and Kenya. So I totally, when you see biodiversity happen, and then you see the difference between biodiversity and then death of diversity, it's like, I mean, even like what you're talking about in the climate movement, in your community, you need to have diversity. That's why we're the blend, because we like all kinds of things. Because it's like, why be just this, you know? So it's diversity, taking diversity away is the death of anything, I believe, from everything I've seen in the natural world. As soon as you put all your eggs in one basket, you're looking, you can get wiped out pretty quickly. So strength is diversity to me. Whether it's animals or people or, anything, that's a strength. And that's something to think of when we look at climate change, is we have a lot of voices that need to be heard and actually worked with to fix what's going on. And I think right now people are sad. They're upset. And the only way to get through that, to me, is to do something.
Yeah, that's definitely how I am. I think it's like a balance of action and being in touch with yourself and like how you can regenerate and rest. Because I definitely have seen many people in the climate movement get burnt out and leave the space, but having that balance between taking action, and that sort of helps you with your despair, and also being connected to what inspires you and makes you feel rested, and being able to have the energy to take that action and also grapple with that despair, because the causes of that despair are not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, that's very true. It's actually just getting bigger, isn't it? It's getting bigger. So I think be kind to each other and keep raising each other up in every way we can. And like you said, everyone's going to come into this and what they can do. And, the smallest thing could be a biggest thing to someone. I mean, it could be everybody's doing all this work and someone comes in and says, hey, look, I really don't have time to do anything, but here's a check for this. Or here, I brought you all food since you're on the, protesting tomorrow. Here's some donuts to keep you going. I'll drop you all off or something. All those little teeny things can add up to
Totally.
something big, right? Cool. Well, I'm so glad Timber Press hooked this up too. That was super cool to see. They do a good job. Are you going to do another one?
I am excited about exploring other books that like sort of meet this moment and think about what are people seeking right now in the genre of climate and graphic literature. So I'm definitely staying busy.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And everyone, all the links are in the episode notes. You can go to Denali Sai, which is SAI.com, and keep up on Blue Sky and Instagram. And we can't wait to find out what you're doing next, because you got to come back on the show and tell us. And anything that's going on too that we can stand up for, you know where we are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us here on Big Blend Radio's Nature Connection show. Keep up with us at bigblendradio.com.